What new kind of life is this that we are beginning? That is a question that St. Ignatius of Loyola asked himself and is recorded in his autobiography as he was moving through his conversion. What new kind of life is this that we are beginning? And I am sure that Jesuits in their novitiate, whether 5 years ago, 50 years ago, all ask themselves that question from time to time. What new kind of life are we beginning now? What have I got myself into? And more importantly, with whom have I got myself into it? In 1968, when I and my group joined, how could I know what was going to happen in the future? How could I know that my group, very important group by the way, was going to produce a future provincial, a future president of the African Assistancy, or the conference rather, and a future novice master. I think all Jubilarians sometimes feel this when they look around at their brothers, when they were, from looking back when they were novices and thinking, how did these people become the men that they became? In our group, we went into all sorts of things like psychology, Father Pat Davis, who became a member of the Irish province, social work, I don't need to mention the names, gerontology, anthropology, Father Lewis, JRS, radio stations, journalism, and in Father Johnson's case, dentistry, which morphed into a full-fledged maxillofacial surgery. Then seminary teaching and good old-fashioned school teaching. So I'm talking about my own group, but I hope there'll be resonances with all the others. Those of us who arrived in Edinburgh in September 1968, who had been to Jesuit boarding schools, kind of slipped easily into the rather monastic form of life that we had there because we kind of assumed we were joining a monastery. The routine and the rhythm were familiar to us. Those who hadn't been in that found it rather more difficult. But even some of the old fathers in those days and old brothers used to refer to the Jesuits as the monks. But as soon as we were sent off on experiment, that's the Jesuit word for pastoral placement, for weeks at a time out of the novitiate, we realized that we needed something more than a bell and a timetable to keep us faithful Jesuits. And then, after the novitiate, some of us were sent to the new Heathrow in London University. And that was certainly not a monastery, but I thought to myself, well, maybe it's a seminary. Well, at the opening mass of this new place in London, just as the priests were about to come out, a very beautiful young lady came clip-clopping down the aisle in high heels. And I realized at that moment, a moment of great insight, that whatever this was going to be, it certainly wasn't going to be a seminary. So we threw ourselves into the life of the University of London. I suppose we kind of thought we were a bit like kind of as though we were in Plato's Academy. And we got into lively student politics. The baby boom generation, that's my generation, really powerful post-war generation, was flexing its muscles all over the campuses in the Western world, and the Jesuit students were doing the same. And we gave our superiors some real sleepless nights by our revolutionary, sometimes revolting behavior. And I well remember the future provincial of Zimbabwe was an honorable secretary of the Central Committee of the Scholastic Revolt. That rocked the British province in 1972. At the same time, the Church was putting the changes of the recently completed Vatican II into practice, but often too slowly and too timidly for our liking. And freedom was in the air and was kind of intoxicating. And meanwhile, Father Mike Lewis was at Wits University in Johannesburg studying anthropology and riding to the campus on his small motorbike in his Roman collar, and putting up with some rather eccentric old Englishmen and Scotsmen in his community, and feeling, poor man, like a stranger in his own country. So we enjoyed what we called playing at being university students. Is that familiar? But quickly, one noticed that those who lost themselves in the activism and became kind of one-dimensional students focused only on their studies tended to leave, and many did, sadly. It was a time in which everything was questioned. You have to remember that our formators, even our formators, were not really sure what Jesuit life post-Vatican II really meant. And they were often not able to give us a firm and authoritative lead. Sometimes they seemed to be making it up as they went along, which of course we loved. It was fantastic for us. By the way, I'm recounting these stories so that they might say something helpful to the young Jesuit congregation here present today. So please be understanding with your superiors in a changing world. The world, I think, may be changing faster today than it was then. The poor chaps are doing their best. Many of those who left the society and married, raised families, left us wondering whether maybe life in the society was a kind of family, a religious family. And today we still talk about religious life as a religious family. Now that's quite obvious if you're a Dominican or a Franciscan, when you have women religious as well. But if you remember, Ignatius was pretty clear that he wanted the society to be men only. Because his early experiments with lady members didn't go very well. So, a family without women didn't quite work, did it? A bit odd to say the least. And what about the children? I mean, we're all adults, aren't we? And then there's a little detail about choice. I never had the choice about the family I was born into, but there's the whole business of choosing to come into the society. I well remember a Dominican psychologist telling me, a woman saying to me that if people entered religious life looking for a substitute family, they were certainly to be disappointed. So maybe not a family, but there are elements there that are helpful. So we struggled on to ordination, and those of us who survived got there. And I have to say rather boastfully here that the year of 1968 did rather well against all the odds. 10 of us arrived in the novitiate, and the novice master, the wise and kindly Frank Cairns, an unsung hero, I think, of the British province, dismissed 5. But 50 years on, the 5 who took vows are still Jesuits. And if you add Father Pat McCarker to the group, that makes 6, because we were waiting for him back there in 1968. We even had a little name on his room, and he didn't turn up, because here in Zimbabwe they had decided to make other arrangements, and they forgot to tell the Brits. Yeah, I suppose it was a kind of UDI before UDI. So we struggled on and we had ordinations. Some of them, I have to confess, were rather spectacular. Perhaps Pope Francis would not really have approved. Some referred to them as coronations. What was going on there? The sociologists probably would have said that the more elaborate the ceremony, the more anxiety about the commitment being made. And there was a lot of anxiety around at the time. Or perhaps we were seeing the priesthood as our commitment as a kind of variation on the diocesan priesthood, the life of the diocesan priest. And of course, Ignatius insisted that we should be priestly, those who are priests should be at the service of the hierarchical church. However, we do have Jesuit brothers and we do have scholastics who are not priests yet. And so perhaps too much insistence on the priestly nature of the order can obscure the bigger picture. And some ways in which the diocesan clergy life has developed since Vatican II perhaps isn't exactly our way of life. I work in a seminary for diocesan seminarians, and I ask them sometimes, how they want to live their lives in the future, and many of them say they want to live alone. Why? Because they want to be in charge. That is probably not what we should be aspiring to as Jesuits. We should be aspiring to living together. And Ignatius had a vision of the Jesuit priest who was a servant and very much part of the Jesuit body. So if we look to the priesthood as part of our identity, it seems to me we need to hold fast to Ignatius's vision of that. And I think he would really understand Francis's phrase, the smell of the sheep. The early priests in the society, as they preached on the squares of Europe, were called the preti riformati, the reformed priests. At a time when the clergy were not in good shape, they provided an example of well-motivated, well-educated clergy. And so Ignatius stands in the tradition of the Church, which strives always for the reform of the priesthood, including the reform of the Jesuit priesthood. Okay, so far this has been a fourfold via negativa. Not monastic life, perhaps, not Plato's academy, not a variation on diocesan life, and not really a family. The definition of Sister Sandra Schneider's IHM might help us a bit. She defines religious life as an adult evangelical companionship. In other words, something a mature adult offers him or herself to for the sake of the gospel. And companionship, of course, was a key word for Ignatius, and we know that he called us the company of Jesus and esteemed the other members as his beloved companions. I call you friends would be the text he would recall. So on occasions like this, we celebrate this companionship. I find myself filled with great gratitude for my companions in the society, both those I joined with, those I worked with in various apostolates. These are the men with whom one has lived and worked and struggled. They have formed me, as I hope to some extent I have formed them. And Ignatius put this in military terms, which is supposed to be a little bit unfashionable today, but I think sometimes we forget that it's only a metaphor. We also forget that he was a bit of an amateur soldier. We also forget that he laid his arms and weapons at the feet of Our Lady, and that his literal soldiering days were over. But there's something about the companionship of soldiers that I think is worth considering, because soldiers are prepared to die. And they're often more willing to die for one another than for their country. That's a really powerful bond. Eh? Not too many academics that I know are willing to die for one another. More likely to stab each other in the back. A soldier looks to his companions to look after him when things are tough, when he's under fire, when he's wounded or sick. He looks to his companion to bury him if he gets killed. He looks to his companion to comfort his family if he's killed. When I was a formator of Jesuits for my sins, I would sometimes ask the young Jesuits, who do you contact if you have a car accident? The answer tells you who your true companions are. Soldiers live and work together. They do this even though, like Jesuits, they haven't chosen each other. They're wildly different types of characters. I mean, how different can you imagine between, say, Father Hlobo and Father Watcham, and not just in age? When I was working in Liverpool, a member of my community was once approached by a man in a bookshop who came up to him and said, "Are you a member of the Pope's SAS?" That's the elite British Special Air Service group. Quite funny, because the Jesuit himself was about that high and had very thick spectacles. But it prompts the question of whether we are actually an elite military outfit. Does the metaphor hold good for that? Is that too arrogant? But Ignatius wanted his companions to be an elite in the sense of being a really good example of learning and holiness to the rest of the church. And interestingly enough, the SAS are often quite well-educated soldiers, often some with degrees in philosophy. At the same time, Ignatius and the first companions also stressed an equality of companionship among them, and they had the custom of calling each other tu rather than vous, and in the Spanish and Italian equivalents. So I don't want to shock you by the use of this traditional Ignatian military metaphor, and even the idea of an elite. But if it's an elite in the sense of men humbly striving for the marges, for the greater glory of God, it seems to me it's okay to try to be elitist. And how do we make it all work? Last year, I invited Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, to come and talk to my students. He's an extremely impressive man. And one student asked a very good question and asked him how did he cope with a busy and varied vocation that he had. And Archbishop Makgoba answered simply and disarmingly, "You need a rule of life." And I thought to myself, well, exactly, you need a rule of life. And of course, we have that, don't we? We have a rule of life, well tried and tested, exercises and the constitutions. Of course, these all have to be adapted to our circumstances. And I really enjoyed the historian John O'Malley, SJ's, stab at this when he proposed 3 rules for Jesuit community life recently. 1, you are not God. Jesuits do sometimes suffer from the God complex. 2, this is not heaven. And 3, don't be a jerk. However, what Makgoba was referring to was actually his life of prayer. And this was literal language, not metaphorical. And sometimes I think it comes to us Jesuits with the force of revelation. And not that long ago, I said to a younger companion who seemed a little overstretched in his apostolic life, "You are a contemplative, you know." And he looked at me as though I had 2 heads. We have sometimes, what we used to lampoon in the South African region, a tendency to get into action man spirituality. You know, running around, saving the world in a world of frenetic activity. Not a contemplative inaction, an active inaction. Contemplation? What contemplation? I'm saving the world, for goodness sake. I don't have time. And here again, Sandra Schneider's is kind of helpful. She defines religious life also as a life form designed with a specific aim of finding God. Finding God in all things, we would say. But we all know that if we want to find God in all things, we also have to find all things in God. And that requires us, as Father Pedro Arupe reminded us, to put aside a substantial and regular time for God alone, that is, in prayer. And the late psychologist Richard Sipe, who accompanied many priests and male religious, says that there's a strong correlation between male religious and priests getting it together spiritually and psychologically, and 1.5 to 2 hours of contemplation per day. Of course, he means everything that we have to do, Mass, examen, breviary, spiritual reading, etc. That's a real challenge, but I think I've come to the conclusion after 50 years that Sipe has more or less nailed the formula for us active religious. And when an Anglican archbishop reminds us simply, we need a rule of life, maybe it's time for us to sit up and listen. So enough of passing on advice to the young. A final word of gratitude. The French call the gratitude the heart's memory. And Ignatius wants us to find gratitude in the contemplation for achieving love, because he believes that it's precisely this heart's memory that will fire us with love and keep us going, keep us in love. And there's a theory about the history of celibacy which says that the extraordinary phenomenon of the large numbers of people embracing celibacy in the early church was not so much that they embraced it for the sake of the kingdom of God, but because of the kingdom of God. In other words, they were so overcome with gratitude towards the Lord who had become human, lived and loved and died for us, they came to the conclusion that a wonderful and appropriate way of returning that love to God was lifelong celibacy. And the other way of doing it was lifelong monogamy. So they embraced celibacy primarily as a loving response to a loving God, and only secondarily perhaps as a means to reflect and build up God's kingdom. I think this early experience is reflected in the response we have to the Lord's graciousness in the spiritual exercises and is summed up in the contemplation for achieving love, and particular in the Sume et Suscipe, the take, Lord, and receive. Take it all. More than one's life one cannot give. And on a day such as this, the grace Jesuits should beg for, I suggest, is an ever deeper gratitude. And so many thanks. I'm grateful to my companions, my fellow Jubilarians, everyone here for your patient listening, and my superiors for the airtime. Thank you.